Every time a generation thinks it has invented a new way to do well, it usually invents a new way to repeat the same old mistake. That is one of the things age teaches you if you pay attention. The symbols change, the clothes change, the slogans change, the platforms change, the emotional language changes, but the trap underneath remains almost embarrassingly similar. A certain picture of success takes hold. A house, a lifestyle, a set of experiences, a visual aesthetic, a way of looking arrived. Then people build toward the picture with real effort, real sacrifice, and real sincerity. They are not play, acting. They are not all fools. That is what makes the outcome so painful. They often work very hard to reach a symbol that was never meant to be the whole plan. That is the mistake. Not spending, exactly. Not ambition, exactly. The mistake is funding the signal before the substance. It is dressing the life in the clothes of arrival before the balance sheet underneath has become strong enough to carry the costume honestly. I have watched this happen over and over again, not once, not twice, through decades, through different markets, different technologies, different political moods, different generations, different cultural vocabularies. Every new generation thinks the old trap belongs to the old people, and that it will be clever enough to invent something more enlightened. Then it takes the same human hunger for status, safety, recognition, and emotional proof, and routes that hunger into a new symbol. That is why the same financial mistake keeps returning with a fresh face. The face changes, the function stays. I want to talk to you about that function, because if you understand it properly, you will stop seeing isolated stories and start seeing a machine. Once you see the machine, you can stop feeding it. That is the whole goal. The public likes simple villains in financial life. Greed, ignorance, laziness, bad luck, wrong timing, the economy, the wrong president. There is truth in some of all of this, and I have no interest in pretending structural realities do not matter. They do. A great deal. Housing affordability changed, careers changed, pensions changed, asset prices changed. The world did move under each generation in different ways, but underneath those real structural shifts, there is another layer, and that layer is behavioral. It is the quiet way a culture teaches people what doing well is supposed to look like. Once that teaching enters the bloodstream, people stop analyzing it. They begin organizing around it. That is where wealth gets misdirected. Let me start with the older version because it is the most respected, and therefore one of the hardest to question. A man grows up in a household that rents. He sees adulthood defined by ownership. The home is not merely shelter. It is legitimacy. It is respectability. It is what having made it looks like in a country organized around the post-war ideal that the family home is the center of the good life. So when he gets the job, gets approved, gets the chance to buy the house in the suburbs with the lawn and the family dinners and the signal of permanence, he does it. Of course he does it, in his world. That is the move. And in fairness, in many cases, it worked well enough for a long time. Home values rose. Inflation helped debt become lighter in real terms. The house turned into a large asset. On paper, the man looked wealthier every passing decade. Then later, often much later, the hidden weakness surfaced. The house appreciated. But the house had silently become too much of the plan. The pension was thinner than expected, or gone. The liquid savings were too light. The retirement accounts were underfunded relative to the size of the visible life. The person had spent years maintaining the symbol of arrival while neglecting the broader architecture required for a long old age. That is not a condemnation of home ownership. It is a condemnation of mistaking one symbol of stability for the whole structure of wealth. The home was not the problem. The belief that the home itself was enough, that was the problem. That is the first version of the trap. Now the next generation comes along and thinks it is more modern. It sees the older ideal and says, we will not be so one-dimensional. We will have more income, more flexibility, more options. We will do better than our parents because we will earn more and live better, not just anchor everything inside one big family asset. And in many cases, this generation did earn more. That is what makes the trap here so seductive. It feels like progress because there really is more money coming in. Promotions arrive, two incomes become normal. The household earns at a level the previous generation would have viewed with amazement. Then the money starts getting translated into the visible signs of a better life, a better car, a larger home, better schools, nicer vacations, better restaurants, more comfort, better everything. And because every individual decision is explainable, no single decision feels like the mistake. That is what makes lifestyle expansion so smooth. No one wakes up and says, "Today I will ruin my future by spending too much." The life just rises to meet the income. That sounds elegant. It is often disastrous, because if every raise is quickly absorbed into a more expensive normal, then the true gap, the distance between what comes in and what remains to become ownership, hardly widens at all. The person can be doing very well by every visible measure and still arrive in middle age with a thinner machine than the income level should have produced. That is the second version of the trap. The first said, "The house proves I made it." The second says, "The upgraded life proves I made it, new costume." Same function. Then we come to the generation that had the old symbols pushed out of reach in a more obvious way. Housing got harder. The financial crisis hit at exactly the age when many people were supposed to be laying foundations. The old path stopped looking merely difficult and started looking almost fraudulent. In that kind of environment, people do not stop wanting a signal of arrival. They change the signal, so the machine adapts. If the house is not available, then the lived life becomes the proof. Now, the signal is not ownership in the old sense. The signal is experience, travel, brunches, city weekends, beautiful memories, the full passport, the story, rich life. The cultural message arrives right on time to justify it. Spend on experiences, not things. Live your life. You cannot take money with you. Memories are the real wealth. There is truth in those lines. That is exactly why they work as a trap. The trap is never built out of total lies. It is built out of partial truths that quietly excuse a dangerous. Experiences can be wonderful. Travel can be wonderful. Memories matter. But when a generation begins using experiences as a substitute for asset formation rather than as an addition to it, the machine has simply found a new language. The result is that the person feels emotionally rich while still remaining balanced. Sheet light. He has stories. He has photos. He has good taste in how to. What he often does not have is enough ownership compounding in the background to change the next 20 years. That is the third version of the trap. The experience did not ruin him. The substitution did. Now, the newest generation arrives already speaking more financial language than any cohort before it. It knows about index funds, compounding, tax wrappers, side hustles, and financial content at an age when older generations barely knew where to begin. This is real progress. I do not dismiss it, but the machine does not care that the vocabulary improved. It adapts again. Now, the signal is the performance of financial adulthood itself. The setup, the apartment, the desk, the brands, the feeling of taste. The visual grammar of having your life together, the posting of financial awareness, the look of wealth before the weight of wealth. This is a fascinating and dangerous mutation because the person may actually be doing some correct things. She may already invest. She may understand compounding earlier than anyone in her family ever did. She may genuinely be more financially literate. But literacy is not the same as structure. If one part of the life is being invested quietly, while a larger part is being spent to maintain the online signal of taste, intention, and arrival, the machine still wins. That is the fourth version of the trap. The performance of wealth displaces the formation of wealth. Again, the person is not ignorant. That is not what makes the trap dangerous. It is dangerous because it can coexist with knowledge. And when a trap can coexist with knowledge, many people assume they must be safe simply because they can name the right concepts. The market does not reward vocabulary. It rewards sequence. That is the deeper line that matters here. Every generation is handed a different picture of what doing well should look like. It absorbs that picture so deeply it stops feeling like a choice. Then, when income arrives, the person begins financing the picture before building the underlying ownership base strong enough to support it. Honestly, that is the one financial mistake every generation repeats. Not because people are stupid, because people are social before they are rational. They care what progress looks like. They care what other people admire. They care about what the room quietly agrees is the signal of a successful life. So the room directs the money, and once the room directs the money, the future usually loses. This is why I say the core problem is not greed. It is premature signaling. You buy the costume before the cash flow. You fund the image before the machine. You spend as though you have arrived before the structure beneath you is strong enough to hold the arrival without strain. That sequence is devastating over decades. Now, if that is the trap, the escape is not complicated. It is just emotionally difficult. You must delay the costume. That is the phrase I want you to remember. Delay the costume. Not forever. Not with bitterness. Not in a way that turns life into a moral punishment. Delay it long enough that the substance becomes real. That is what the people who truly escape the trap eventually learn how to do. The older person who gets it right does not let the house become the whole plan. He funds the retirement machine too. He treats the home as one asset among others, not as the sacred centerpiece that excuses neglect elsewhere. The high earner who gets it right does not allow every raise to become immediate evidence of a larger life. She may enjoy some of the fruits, but she traps a large share of the increase into ownership before the visible standard of living gets a claim on it. The person who loves experiences and still gets it right does not stop living. He simply refuses to let the experience budget substitute for capital formation. One excellent trip instead of 4 socially obligatory ones. One intentional memory instead of a whole life trying to sedate anxiety with weekends away. The financially literate young person who gets it right does not try to look like wealth while building it. She builds it faster than she performs it. She is willing to have less to show and more to own. That is a completely different path. Do you see the pattern? Assets first. Lifestyle second. That sentence matters more than most complicated financial systems. The house can come, but not as the whole plan. The nicer life can come, but not at the same speed as income. The experiences can come, but not as a replacement for ownership. The aesthetic can come, but not ahead of the actual number. Assets first, lifestyle second. Every generation that becomes quietly secure eventually rediscovers that rule, whether it heard it early or paid to learn it later. Now I need to say something else, because people often hear an argument like this and immediately become punitive with themselves. They review their past, like prosecutors, the house, the trips, the upgrades, the years, the choices. They feel shame. I do not find shame. Shame often becomes paralysis, and paralysis is just the trap wearing a more miserable face. What matters is not whether you can rewrite 15 years. What matters is which version of the machine you are financing. Now that is the practical question. Is it still the house swallowing the whole architecture? Is it still the lifestyle that rises beside every pay increase and leaves the gap unchanged? Is it still the experiences that make the present feel richer while leaving the future underbuilt? Is it still the online performance of taste, literacy, and polish that costs more than it should? Name it honestly once named. It can be reordered. That is the beautiful part. The trap is powerful because it feels natural, but it is not destiny. It is sequence, and sequences can be changed. The home can stop being the whole plan. The raise can stop being an automatic spending signal. The experience budget can be cut without life becoming barren. The aesthetic can be decoupled from the wallet. The signal can be demoted. The substance can finally get its turn. That is how real escape begins. Quietly. It does not begin with a dramatic speech. It begins with a changed order. Money comes in, assets first. What remains may go to lifestyle. If there is no remainder, then the lifestyle was too early. That is all. The reason this rule is so hard to follow is that it asks you to look slightly less arrived than you actually want to look. It asks you to tolerate the older car, the smaller house, the fewer trips, the less complete visual proof. It asks you to let people underestimate your progress for a while. That is emotionally hard because social creatures hate appearing behind. But I will tell you something the public never says loudly enough. It is much better to look less arrived and be becoming secure than to look fully arrived while the machine underneath is weak. One path flatters the ego, the other protects the future. Most people choose the ego first. Then later they call the resulting strain unexpected. It was not unexpected. It was financed. That is why I think this topic matters so much. It is not about criticizing one generation or defending another. It is about seeing the machine clearly enough that you stop confusing the costume with the cash flow. The public sees the visible layer and assumes it understands the story. It usually does not. The visible layer is almost always downstream of the real decision. The real decision is sequence. What got funded first? The asset or the appearance? The machine or the mood? The future or the signal? That is the whole game. And if I could leave you with one line, it would be this. Every generation is handed a different image of what success should look like. The people who become truly secure are the ones who stop financing the image long enough to build the reality. I want to go one level deeper now, because people often hear a framework like this, nod in agreement, and then fail to change anything because they still do not understand why the trap is so emotionally powerful. It is powerful because it does not feel like imitation. It feels like adulthood. That is the subtlety. Each generation receives its signal of arrival wrapped in moral language. The house is not just a purchase, it is responsibility. The larger life is not just spending, it is reward for effort. The experience budget is not just consumption, it is a healthier philosophy. The aesthetic is not just display, it is taste, intentionality, self-expression, and self-respect. That is why these signals are so difficult to resist. They are not asking you to be vulgar. They are asking you to be understandable. Human beings want to be understandable to their own era. They want the people around them to look at the life they built and say, yes, that person is doing well. That is a very deep social desire. It is older than markets and older than banks. It sits underneath almost every spending decision that later has to be justified with practical language. This is why I think many financial errors are not really money errors. First, they are belonging errors. A person sees what his world admires. Then he pays to participate in the admiration. That is the real mechanism. And once you understand that, you stop moralizing so crudely about spending. You stop saying, why would anyone do that? The answer is almost always the same, because it made emotional sense inside the social world they were living in. The boomer bought the house because in his era the house was not only shelter, it was citizenship in the adult world. The Gen X household expanded because the larger life was the visible receipt proving the long hours had been worth it. The millennial spent on experiences because experience became the culturally approved substitute for blocked ownership. The Gen Z investor spends on the look because visibility itself is now part of social existence. Different eras. Same emotional engine. That engine is why the trap survives contact with intelligence. Very smart people fall into it. Highly educated people fall into it. Financially literate people fall into it. Because the trap does not usually defeat knowledge. It defeats sequence through emotion. Now, if you want to break the sequence, you must learn how to diagnose your own era's trap in yourself, and that requires harsher honesty than most people enjoy. Ask yourself this, if your income rose 20% tomorrow, what is the first thing in your mind that would like a claim on it? Not what should happen. What wants to happen? That answer reveals the current ruler of your financial life. If the first thought is the better house, the renovation, the nicer district, the visible upgrade that would finally make the life feel proper, then the housing signal may still be running the machine. If the first thought is relief through more lifestyle, then the expansion signal is still in charge. If the first thought is a trip, a memory, a life reward, because you deserve to live now, then the experience signal is probably stronger than the ownership instinct. If the first thought is a better setup, a cleaner image, better visible taste, a more polished outer shell, then the performance signal still owns more of the budget than you may realize. There is no shame in noticing this, but you must notice it. Because until you know which signal still has the steering wheel, every raise will keep being translated into the same old costume. That is how decades disappear. The next question is even more powerful. What in your life is maintained, mainly so that other people, or a former version of you, can continue to believe you have arrived? That question cuts deeper. A house can be right for a family and still be oversized for the machine supporting it. A car can be pleasant and still represent borrowed identity. A travel pattern can be joyful and still function as an anesthetic against financial anxiety. A set of visible purchases can look like self-expression and still be mostly social camouflage. Again, the issue is not whether the thing is evil. The issue is the job the thing is silently performing. That is the question adults should ask much more often. What is this expense doing besides its practical use? If the answer is, it helps me feel okay about where I stand, then you are not only dealing with money, you are dealing with a signal, and signals are expensive when they are financed ahead of the structure. I want to say something here that I think matters greatly. The reason so many people struggle to delay the costume is that delaying the costume can feel like disappearing. If everyone around you is marking progress visibly and you choose not to, you may feel behind even while you are getting stronger. That is an emotionally difficult trade. Most people would rather feel ahead now than quietly become safe later. That is one reason true financial security looks so ordinary for such a long time. The person doing it right often looks under-celebrated in the beginning. That is the price. The culture cannot easily applaud what it cannot see. So if you want to escape the trap, you need a private definition of progress strong enough to compete with the public one. That is where real maturity enters the picture. Can you look at an account balance that grew while the visible life stayed mostly the same and call that progress, even if nobody else notices? Can you turn down the upgrade and still feel the week was successful? Can you take the raise and root most of it to ownership while friends assume you are now at a level that should look different? Can you let the world misunderstand your pace? That is the emotional core of the whole subject. Once you can do that, the trap weakens immediately, because now you are no longer financing admiration. You are financing insulation. And insulation is what most people eventually realize they wanted all along. They thought they wanted proof. What they really wanted was room. Room to breathe. Room to say no. Room to age. Room to survive a market fall, a job shock, a health problem, a family emergency, a bad year, or a long retirement without every decision becoming a small financial referendum. That is what assets buy. Not just returns room. I think this is where many generational money conversations go wrong. They become arguments about taste instead of structure. One group says houses are overrated. Another says experiences are foolish. Another says the younger people only care about aesthetics. Another says the older people had it easier. All of those arguments contain some truth and almost no liberation. The liberating question is simpler. What does this thing do to the room in my life? Does it increase the room or does it reduce it while flattering me? That one question can untangle a great many false choices. The house can increase room if it is bought wisely and does not consume the whole architecture. The experience can increase room if it enriches life without colonizing asset formation. The aesthetic can increase room if it stays inside honest limits and does not become identity rent. The issue is never the object alone. It is the sequence and the proportion. That is why I believe proportion is one of the least glamorous and most powerful words in personal finance. Not everything must be denied, but almost everything must be proportioned. A raise does not need to produce zero lifestyle improvement. It simply should not produce 80 or 90% lifestyle improvement while the ownership gap remains weak. A good year does not require monastic abstinence. It does require sequence. Assets first, then some celebration if the structure can bear it. That is the order adults should trust. Now, let me give you a practical way to think about reordering your own life, When new money comes in, imagine it arriving with two claimants standing beside it. One is your current self, the other is your future structure. Your current self has perfect rhetoric. It says the money should feel like life now. It says you have worked hard. It says there is no point earning more if nothing changes. It says the world is uncertain, so you should enjoy things while you can. It says the visible life matters too. It says everyone else at your level already lives this way. Give me enough years of priority, and I will buy you room you cannot currently imagine. The current self is more persuasive. The future structure is more valuable. That is why you need rules. Not because rules are elegant, because rules are how the quiet claimant gets a vote. Maybe the rule is that half of every raise is automatically routed into investments before any lifestyle decision is discussed. Maybe the rule is that one large experience per year is allowed and all other I deserve it moments must be financed from a fund budget that does not touch ownership formation. Maybe the rule is that any major visible upgrade must be delayed a full year after the income increase that made it possible. Maybe the rule is that no aesthetic purchase above a certain threshold happens unless a larger amount went to assets first. The exact rule matters less than the principle. The future must stop being whatever is left over after the present has finished negotiating with itself. That is the real reform. And if you do it long enough, something interesting happens. The signal loses its emotional hold. You stop needing the costume so urgently. Not because you have become joyless, because the structure beneath you begins creating a quieter confidence than display ever could. That is one of the least discussed, but most powerful transformations in wealth. Building at first. You delay the signal through discipline. Later, you stop needing the signal because the underlying security starts doing the emotional work. The signal was once hired to perform. That is a much better life. You no longer need the car to tell you that you are progressing. You no longer need the trip to tell you that you are alive. You no longer need the better kitchen to tell you that your labor counted. The machine itself starts telling you the reserves, the growing assets, the widening gap, the declining dependency on each paycheck, the increasing ability to choose. That is what being arrived actually feels like. Quietly stronger, not loudly explained. That is why I keep coming back to the same line. Delay the costume. Delay it until the reality is sturdy enough that the costume, if you still want it, no longer threatens the machine. This is not a small difference. It is the difference between looking successful and becoming hard to injure. And if you really want to know which people in each generation will quietly outperform their peers over the next 20 years, it will often be the ones who understood that distinction early enough to be willing to look slightly behind while they were actually getting ahead. That is what the crowd almost never sees in time. The crowd sees the symbol. The wealthy learn to study the sequence, always what got funded first. That is the truth beneath every era.